could try to recover the lost first episode, I think. The one where the batteries ran dead and I didn't know what I was doing.
Well, we caught some of it
We
last week or whenever that was.
Yeah.
I don't remember what all we did.
But we started with the thought experiment of in 1000 BC, you still have Egypt, you still have ancient Greece, you still have Mesopotamia, Rome has not been founded yet, and you have China. And if history is a game of last man standing, it's pretty astonishing that we have if you wanted to ask what would ancient Egypt have been like if it still kept to its old gods and its old architecture and all that, well, we have a living example of that. Sitting there in the Yellow River Valley.
Yeah. It is amazing.
One mistake I think that is important to realize is like you can't anachronistically project everything back as if China was always the same. So
That's what I always get stuck on is this question of continuity, right? You're making the claim there is coherence from 1000 BC to now, right?
Even older, technically,
right?
If you're,
where there isn't coherence, and I can find Rome on a map today.
Sure.
I can find Egypt on a map today, right? So what can you sort of elucidate or
Well, that kind of is the ultimate. What is continuity? It's a tough one because existences change, and China of 1000 BC is nothing like China of today, but there is continuity.
Right, you're making the claim. You can say that it's the same empire.
It's the same culture evolving through time. It's the same civilization. Even though in 1000 BC there is no China because there is no Qin state.
Right.
There's no word China. It's
right.
Zhonghua, the 4 Cs. And so,
what do you think the continuity is in? How is it continuous?
It's in the language.
The language,
right?
It's hiding in the language in plain sight. They roll it forward with them. Yeah. So if I genuinely believe, they have their rivers and mountains. They have their sacred mountains that people have been visiting since before the invention of writing. Mount Wutai and others. There were travel logs of like internal tourism of like, this is what the gentleman does. You make a tour of these sites you could go and buy a booklet that told you what you had to go see if you were going to be a reputable gentleman in 300 BC.
If you were going to be worldly and well-traveled.
Yeah, Europeans toured around and you had to go see Venice, stuff like that. The grand tour of Europe that aristocrats went on. They had that in the year 0.
Right.
They had cookbooks too, I think.
Yeah, yes, they did. And so so they have that, their geography, they have a sacred geography. But speaking of continuity, if aliens came and destroyed the earth, blew it up, and a ship containing Chinese speakers made it out, they would still be carrying China with them.
It's funny because I had the same sort of frustration or confusion when I was, I was in a Religions of China class or whatever, and we were just sort of going a brief historical overview of the dynasties, and it'd be like, well, this is this dynasty was outsiders, and so it made me wonder, well, how are we counting? How is this still a Chinese dynasty if they were foreign invaders? Right. But the answer was sort of the same answer. Well, the writing and the language was maintained or adopted and continued.
Yeah. And in the history of it, if you actually look at the demographics, so the longest period of disunity and rule by foreigners was between the collapse of the Han and the rise of the Sui, which is basically 200 AD to about 600 AD. So it's about a 400-year period, and that was the period when the steppe nomads first really achieved very decisive military supremacy over settled societies. It's no coincidence that this is also the time of the Huns and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the sedentary societies are on their knees because they cannot do anything to stop these Turkic tribes. So there were multiple Turkic dynasties, especially in northern China, that over a 400-year period that came and went, and they were incredibly thin. You know, it might have been 40,000 Turkic warriors, aristocracy ruling maybe in their little corner of not even the entire Yellow River floodplain, just the Northern Wei dynasty, things like that, ruling over 7 million Chinese. You know, they couldn't assimilate them. The assimilation went the other way.
And why is that? Is that because they had horses and weapons, or?
Well, it wasn't just that. It was the Turkics, oh boy, the great stirrup controversy and the high back saddle. So before the invention of the stirrup, you could not have heavy cavalry and you also needed the high backed saddle, because if you charged a person and tried to hit them with your lance, you'd get knocked off your horse.
Okay.
And the stirrup also really helps with your horse archery because it gives a more stable platform. They time it so they can shoot when all four hooves are off the ground. They're so good. They're born in the saddle.
Yeah.
But if you have a stirrup, it gives you the cavalry suddenly goes between being a light horse archer.
Occasionally conceived in the saddle too.
Yeah.
There's some art, erotic
sure.
art where
I don't doubt
on
it.
top of horseback. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so they had the Turk, and also the spread. This is when the Turks had really good iron working and foundries and indigenous. They made it themselves, and so you'd go on the steppe, and it's hundreds of miles of grassland, and then there's these mountains surrounded by nomads, completely impregnable, and it's full of guys smelting iron and making armor for their lords and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Turks were always associated with good iron working. And so all of a sudden, like an earlier period where there's no heavy cavalry and maybe it's light chariots and light horse archers, they don't have stirrups, they have just kind of little loops for their feet.
Mm-hmm.
Those cavalry armies are less intimidating and they have less of an advantage over a settled society.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time you get to Attila the Hun and stuff, they can chop up any sedentary army completely. And that's the period of time where you see basically 400 AD to 1400 AD. That's when the steppe nomads ruled, And after that, gunpowder takes them out.
Yeah.
So
That's a long time.
1,000 years. Yeah.
Again, it's a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really not a long time to an evolutionary biologist, but
Right,
it is
right,
to
right.
somebody that understands your point from earlier that where's the Roman Empire, where's Egypt, but yet China's still here, and that is a long time, a couple thousand years.
Yeah. Rome did not really survive the Huns in
Yeah.
a way. Eastern Rome did, but that's kind of different. And there's a reason why Anatolia is now called Turkey. And the story, it's a really your heart goes out to these poor ancient civilizations that date maybe back to the Bronze Age or earlier, and these nomads just come and wash over them over and over again, and they can't do anything. You're stuck in a city, you're all a bunch of farmers, and then 120,000 Turks appear on your border.
And
What
then-
are you supposed to do?
And then some years later, Genghis Khan, and
Yeah. He was the apotheosis and the end of it in a way.
yeah.
But so in northern China, you had this 400-year period of disunity where it's like generation after generation, you are ruled by these Turks who probably spend, once they've conquered that area, because the North China Plain is perfect pasture, wide open. They spend more time fighting each other, but the indigenous Chinese are sitting there just trundling along being Chinese, and eventually they all intermarry, and they don't speak Turkish anymore in Shanxi province.
Yeah.
It came back, China came back.
Yeah.
And they took there's some loan words, and they intermarried, and there's some Turkic last names in northern China and stuff like that, but the Chinese civilization is such a juggernaut when it comes to assimilation. They came back.
Yeah.
The Sui dynasty, and they kept the memory of the Han.
Well, see,
on the chin.
that was going to be a question I was going to ask you, because you say the language is what helped that keep on. But part of that language is probably a very early awareness of history
Yes.
in a more objective sense than, say, a Western view of history.
It's okay. It's really interesting to say in an objective sense, because, and like some Chinese would probably, quote. There was the records of the grand historian Sima Qiang under the big three. You have Qin Shi Huangdi, you have Sima Qiang, and you have Zhang Jian. I'm sure I got that wrong. The envoy he sent up to the UAZ. He sends Qin Shi Huangdi is like, no, wait, shit, I fucked it up.
I sort of remember the story, but not the details.
Yeah, I'm thinking Wu Di of Han,
Yeah.
the later one. But there was a historian who wrote the history of all of China in the early Han Dynasty under the most dynamic emperor they had of Wu Di, and who was just terrible. Wu Di the terrible, Wu Di the great, and he pissed off Wu Di because he criticized his policies, and he was castrated for it. But which is the ultimate Confucian, and he said, well, I'm not going to kill myself even though I should, and I'll bear this shame because I need to finish this history. And historians of China look at that history itself as an act of creation. He was creating China by making its history. So they're always making their own history.
No.
They control it.
Yeah.
So to call it objective is really, I don't know, that's a conversation that really should be had. Because when we talk Westerners, they don't have a completely objective sense of history either. Maybe nobody does, but they create their own history.
But I think it can be argued that modern historians strive for that.
They do.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's an awareness of that bias in history that helps us get to the real history.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there comes a point where you realize there are no truly objective players. Everybody has skin in the game.
But the thing is that you can try.
Yes.
And I think this is what's good this is why science works.
Yes.
Science are biased too, but
Yes.
it's a way of avoiding bias, and I think honest historians.
Yes.
That's my point. And
Yeah.
that perhaps in trying to get a more objective view of history, whether it was an unfolding of God's plan. We know it was the Yellow Emperor was the son of heaven and all that,
Right.
but there might have been a more realistic appreciation. I don't
Yes.
know.
And they did, and that was the thing, what they had, because they had the continuity of writing. I mean, it's their writing system.
Yeah.
And eventually, especially with that imperial exam system, which only came later,
Yeah.
but there was an intellectual tradition at the heart of power that is the best example we have as Westerners is like a Marcus Aurelius type thing, where you had a series of works that you must know by heart, and these are the people you read. You have to read Cicero, you have to read Polybius. Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic philosopher, and they had a tour. You go around Athens, you go and participate in the Eleusinian mysteries, and you go to Delphi and these other oracles. The Romans had that, and that was lost with that breakdown, and between that and Christianization. A similar in flavor intellectual tradition has persisted in China since before Confucius. And it has kept going, and it's still going. That's what I mean when we talk about continuity.
Yeah. Whereas in the West, later it was Shakespeare and the Bible.
Yes, yes, absolutely it was. And you saw in Europe, in Western Europe, or Christendom, let's call it that, you had the tours that you went through, and you went to Paris, and you went to Vienna, and you went to Venice, and other you had an intellectual aspect to the upper classes that they were a standard they were held to. Yeah.
When you talk about, we're almost saying that the language is the vehicle of the continuity.
Yeah.
Almost.
It carries it. Yeah.
But when we say the language, we must really be talking about the written language, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's both. I mean, because a spoken language also evolves through time. But
Right, exactly. I mean, Shakespeare and the King James Bible are, modern English,
Yeah.
right.
right?
But you
and
can't.
we've got
How could you ever pull? Could you ever pull the Bible out of any Western language? No, it's there. The same way you can't. They say you cannot. As Arabic is inextricable from the Quran. They have an intellectual. Islam has an intellectual tradition too,
sure,
and a
sure.
continuity. That's what I'm saying. It's the same thing. And you could you could say what are the big four civilizations that transcend borders, and the specifics of the nation state system that we have. Islamic civilization, we have no problem saying that. Christian civilization or Christendom, Orthodox civilization, Chinese, Hindu civilization,
Yeah.
maybe.
I'm just thinking about language continuity,
Well, it's there.
because in the English tradition, well, that's a little too specific, maybe.
Right.
Although you mentioned Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
But
But-
Chaucer was a different language, and
Right.
Beowulf was a
Very
different
different.
language,
Very, very
right?
But
So-
Chaucer was also, he was a transition from an older to a different way of doing things. Or am I thinking Milton or Chaucer? I think it was
Chaucer, yeah.
Chaucer. I mean, I remember hearing a lecture actually by an administrator at PLU who talked about Chaucer at this transition at a cultural crisis. Something I don't remember the details, but
Yeah.
but
Well, it happens. I mean, sometimes it seems to happen organically, but then you look at it in the context of when it happens, and you have an individual, an author like Virgil, writing the Aeneid for the Romans just when they needed it.
You
They
mean
had
just when they needed it? Sorry.
Oh, God. I'm cutting that out. Cut
that
his
was
mic.
quick. That was quick. That was quick. That was
So yeah, the Romans had really found themselves, and as like a truly Mediterranean power and the imperial power. And then lo and behold, a guy writes a story based on deliberately. He was Homer for the Romans, And in the Aeneid, he goes, "Well, this is the story of Aeneas, who is a Trojan, and the Trojans are older than the Greeks, because the Romans had kind of a cultural inferiority complex. They're importing Greek teachers as slaves.
Right.
They're taking all the art and all this other stuff. They're coming to a culture that's older and more deeply rooted than their own.
Yeah.
The Greeks in the early part of the Roman conquest, the Greeks are looking down on the Romans.
Yeah.
They're a bunch of country bumpkins.
Yeah.
They're good at fighting, but that's about it.
They're brutes.
They're brutes. Yeah. And then the Romans.
Jocks and brutes.
Yeah. And so then you had this situation where, and Romans themselves are going, we conquered the Greeks, politically, but culturally they conquered us.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Is Roman architecture Greek architecture? We don't have much. There is an older Etruscan substrate of Roman architecture, but it's pretty much Greek. Corinthian columns are named for Corinth in Greece.
So, don't all civilizations so-called higher civilizations in quotes treat the others as barbarians?
Most of them do.
I mean,
the Chinese certainly do.
I mean, Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth.
Yeah.
I mean, it basically comes down to probably originated in a tribal situation, but it emerges, I think, into the states and religions and all these great civilizations that I mean, it happens today.
Right, and it's interesting, and because it can appear seemingly out of nowhere sometimes, and you realize, like all information and all continuity, it gathers. It's a process, and then it's an emergent property that just, as if by magic, And think of it, like the various tribes of Gaul. Mostly all spoke the same language, constantly fighting each other, intermarrying, alliances, working hard. They raised a lot of cattle and all this other stuff. And they had a culture, but you wouldn't say that they had, and they certainly had a civilization, but they didn't have anything resembling a kind of set, standardized cultural set of expectations that say a Roman aristocrat would have. And lo and behold, the Gauls were assimilated by the Romans. You know, your grandfather might have been a warrior on foot, you know, who was killed by Julius Caesar, but you're sitting there in a toga a couple of generations later,
Right.
reading Greek,
Yeah.
It's all about having a standard curriculum, is what
It's
it
a
sounds
great- yeah,
like.
That's not a bad way to think about it. Yeah, and then 700 years later, Gaul is now France, Frankland, and the way they're living is much more closer to the Gauls, you know, who are not their ancestors. They're invaders, but small tribes of Franks fighting each other, living in the woods,
Yeah.
speaking kind of the same language, marrying, intermarrying, raising cows, all of them illiterate,
Yeah.
pretty much. It's pretty extraordinary.
It is.
Christianity found itself after the fall of Rome. You know, the imperial church was so different, but then by around the year 1200 or a bit earlier, you have a standardized set of things you have to read. You all have to read Augustine of Hippo.
Yeah.
You all have to say the right prayers, this other thing, and that Christendom ruled that part of the world for a good 1,000 years, and now it's going away right before our eyes.
Yeah.
The cathedrals are now museums.
Yeah.
They have no religious power in them anymore.
Yeah.
In
Europe,
right.
former Christendom. You know,
Right.
Christendom is over, pretty much.
Well, how about Eastern Christendom?
It's not over, is it? Yeah.
Doesn't seem like it.
It has more potency to it. You can tell just by the way people, you know it by its fruits. Ah,
Yeah.
it still motivates people. There's some motivated Catholics and members of Christendom and stuff, but it's disintegrating.
So the Eastern Orthodox, where is that?
Right here.
Oh, really? But I mean, geographically, where is it holding strong? Russia?
I get that. That's what
Russia.
came to mind as the sort of.
The mother. Yeah. The guarantor.
I mean,
guarantor.
yeah. I'm not knowledgeable enough to claim, you know.
Yeah.
But that was the picture I got asking about Eastern Christendom.
Sure.
I was just sort of thinking.
Well,
This is sort of much. It's an aside, yet it isn't. I had somebody ask me one time, why are salmon species named with Greek names? You know, and I'm thinking because most
Wow.
Latin names
Latin.
are Latin.
Right.
And the only answer I could come up with was it was a Russian ichthyologist who described the salmon species, and it might have been the grip of Greek.
Right.
are you talking about Bering?
No, the guy not Bering, but I forget who the biologist was that described. But that was my answer.
That's
Is that maybe
interesting.
how you know
Certainly.
it could be, and again the power of language.
Yeah.
Right?
I grew up calling Mary the Theotokos.
Okay.
You know, it's Greek for godmother, I believe.
Uh,
And you know, we
They,
called Easter Pascha, and you can find that in, you know, Spanish and other languages. It's a derivation of Passover, but it's
Yeah.
what we call Easter.
Yeah.
And you know, you get theophany and epiphany, and
right.
you know, so
They-
sort of dotted. You know, I'd learn hymns in Greek
Sure.
occasionally, but
In the context, it's
as a you know, as a Washingtonian, you know, no sort of ethnic reason except that my folks were converts to
Right.
Eastern Orthodoxy, and
Right.
so we had this sort of the baggage that comes with it. Was sort of interesting.
well, and so like specific to the Eastern Orthodox thing, the believers in it in Russia, some of them call Moscow the Third Rome because it's Rome to Constantinople to Moscow, right? And they do see it as, and it was seen at the time even as the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire was breaking apart, and they were sacked first by Catholic Franks, you know, in 1204.
Which crusade was that?
The fourth.
Okay, thank you.
They said no. The seat of God, that continuity or that power is now residing with us, the Grand Princes of Moscow. And There's
Right.
a double-headed black eagle on the crest of the Russian imperial family because Vladimir the Great who converted to Christianity, married a niece of Basil II, I believe, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. And so that's what I mean by continuity. And they see themselves now as the protectors of all Orthodox Christians and Orthodox Christianity in the world. And that also explains the interesting relationship between Serbia and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
That is still a very real dynamic because the Serbians in general are an Orthodox Christian civilization, and they're a part of that sphere. And so the Russians took the breakup of Yugoslavia very badly, and they were very angry about the NATO.
Huh.
NATO is what? Is that Christendom? Ooh, you know, the breakup and like the NATO intervention in Serbia, they took very badly, and they still are mad about it, kind of. And they're taking some of the Russian bloggers that I follow are talking about the breakaway of the Kievian, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and it has a new archbishop and all this other stuff. They take Westerners are like, what does it matter? What does it matter if Kiev has a separate church? And the Orthodox Christians are like, it matters. It really matters. They are anathema.
Yeah, right.
You know, so that's
They don't mess around with that
They
stuff.
don't mess around.
Man.
So
There's a whole holiday. Have I told you about this? Well, it's
the anathema holiday.
yeah. Well, I think we call it. I think it's the same service. We call it the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and it commemorates like the return of the icons after some iconoclasts.
Oh,
you know,
wow.
I can't remember if it was Theodora or
It
Empress
was.
Theodora.
It was.
So we both celebrate like this sort of victory of the icons coming back.
Sure.
And then also there's this whole
Iconodual.
what's that?
That's somebody who likes the
Oh, okay. Iconodual.
iconoclast takes
Gotcha.
their icons away.
Right,
Get
and
them out of-
Iconoduals are the fans.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. And then, but part of that service also is just listing a bunch of heretical thought or people, and then the congregation says anathema, blah 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 blah, anathema.
Really?
It's pretty
The
dramatic.
Monophysites, anathema.
The Arians, you know.
Anathema.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
that's-
It's great.
Oh, man.
He's sort of he's like one of the first like heretics we learned about as
Arius,
Arius, yeah, which is kind of funny because he seemed well intentioned. You know,
Oh,
you were
they
just
always are.
you're just theologians trying to theologue or whatever,
yeah.
you know. But someone has to win most of the time. I think there's one instance. This is sorry for tangenting. I think there's an instance of like two people on different sides of an argument both being canonized as saints.
Yeah, that sounds.
Because you know they were well intentioned, but that's sort of not how they usually do it.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so in the context of continuity, that's what continuity means when it does matter. You know.
But to whom does it matter, and what are its roots? I mean, these are not a bunch of intellectuals or generals sitting back and saying, we're thinking about this the way we're talking about this
That's
now.
correct. Yeah.
It happens. And so what is the root? Is it back in the tribal, I mean, deep roots would be the tribal things, or is it these institutional memories that last for a long time in these highly liturgical institutions?
Right. And why do some things last and others
Right.
break?
Well, I mean,
You know.
and that's I would like your question for me. It's like asking, why it's epistemology. Why do we think the way we think? So to look for an origin in human nature, you can't pull it out and say this is when it started. We have always been like this, and I see it more. None of these arguments would happen without the invention of writing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's kind of a blissful, you know, do you live in an eternal present if you have no writing system? Oh, it might be nice. But so these arguments get carried forward, but also, I mean, if you're a young person and you are forced to read the Bible, it changes your mind. It changes your worldview. And so it creates at the interface between the institution and the individual.
Yeah. Well, Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth, argues that that's rooted in human nature.
Yes.
That every culture I mean, obviously there's variation and stuff, and I haven't watched that in 30 or 40 or 50 years. I'm getting old. But I mean, the point is that's rooted in somewhere.
Yes.
It really is rooted. And so are we all of these leaders and intellectuals merely puppets at the end of the strings of these something deeply rooted in history? That's my question.
Absolutely.
Right, so they're agents of the myth rather than the.
Right.
You can't. I mean, imagine a political leader that came up and said, "Yeah, we're all alone in the universe, and meaning is something that we have to create and guard."
Yeah.
And we have the universe perversely gives us infinite freedom, but also infinitely constrains what we can do. You know, you are simultaneously.
Right, that'd be Emperor Carl Sagan.
Well,
You know?
but,
we don't want that guy. He has to sit there and say the myths.
well, I mean, on the other hand, if we don't recognize we are sitting on this thin little envelope with our population exploding, doing the same old things over and over again, we are doomed. Period. If we don't take a more modern, worldwide view, if we don't act and think globally, we're screwed.
Like a Chinese person wouldn't necessarily say that. They might say, as long as China is a flame that we carry with us. It's the light, and it's our job as the current carrier. We are the people currently responsible for keeping that flame going. We got to blow on it.
Yeah.
We have to give it some fuel. That's what sustains us. This global civilization, most of them are barbarians. Yeah. They might not care, and they might blow out that flame, and we have to make it through the next few centuries. A global civilization, maybe. Science, maybe.
Well, I mean, of course, most of the people I've been going to China for 30 years, and I know many of their intellectuals, party members, and not. Yes. I would say that many of them, not all of them, do have a global attitude. They were so open to the United States and the West. They really were.
Yes.
These are intellectuals mainly, but so, I mean, I think it's not quite as simple as.
Of course.
Yeah. Well, of course it never is, and I know you didn't think it was, but I mean, I actually think if we don't figure out we are a single species that evolved on this planet with the capable of reason, organized reason, and studying, understanding history, not believing in things, but understanding it, as E.O. Wilson said. Yeah. If we don't do that, we're screwed. I mean, we're screwed civilizations are screwed. There'll still be people in Cascadia that are.
I mean, it's really strange, but I'm sitting there trying to figure out, okay, this is the artistic aspect of Cascadia and how it intersects with Cascadian architecture. The continuity. This could be something that has a continuity. These are the books you have to read, and these are the. Here's your liturgy. Here's the Cascadian liturgy, and it scares the shit out of me.
Yeah.
Because that power, religion is a terrible thing to try to manipulate for people, because it's not fair. It's not fair.
Yeah. So.
I mean, early Islam is incredible to read about, because they were finding themselves in. It wasn't written down. The Quran wasn't written down. It was memorized and shared among people. It was only written down around 750, These desert nomads who have real reason to believe that God is on their side, because they just conquered the known world. Yeah. They were conquering areas they didn't know really existed. Incredible. You read about the stories that they have, of the conquest of Egypt, how it happened. They saw, it wasn't Abu Bakr, it was maybe it was, but they saw the messenger behind them on a horse or a camel coming from the second caliph. Muhammad had died by then, and the commander assumed he's probably telling me to come back. But the message was, if you cross into Egypt, if you cross the Brook of Egypt before the sun is down, go and conquer Egypt. But if you haven't, conquer it. And so they just stepped on the other side of the river.
Whoa.
And then Egypt fell very quickly. Byzantine Egypt. They took it from the Eastern Roman Empire.
Huh.
Tiny minority of Arabs,
Right.
And probably hardly any conscripts, and they just took the most rich province in the Mediterranean. the tax base for
Yeah.
Byzantium, the thing that was feeding Constantinople. Incredible.
You'd think you'd try and keep a hold of that.
They did. But they were in tough shape. The poor Byzantines. I mean, they were.
When was this?
Oh, the Muslim conquest of Egypt would have been like 690s, 700s AD.
Mm-hmm.
So this is after they had lost the Levant. They had lost the Levant too. One of the most decisive battles in human history was the Battle of Yarmouk, which is by the West Bank today. A huge Byzantine army is cobbled together after this devastating war, which we covered before, against the Sasanians. This is Heraclius. This is under Heraclius, the guy who got aquaphobia.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so they cobbled together this other big army. The Muslims were outnumbered like 5-1. And they're like, okay, we're going to try to take the Levant. And the Byzantines screwed up. And it was like a 5-day battle. Of like ins and outs. Like day 1, this happens. Day 2, this happens. And the commander of that army, Khalid Walid, whose nickname was the Sword of God, decisively on that 5th day, he gave him a fake out. Like, oh, if you want to retreat, go this way. And the retreat turned into a rout, and it was over after that. I mean, it was just after that, it was 200 more years of Islamic victories. Incredible. Jerusalem peacefully surrendered.
That's quite a nickname.
That's a good nickname to have, I would think. Yeah.
It makes me wonder, does the word assassin come from?
Hashin Shin.
Yeah, which is it comes from the Arabic or is it back in the
hashish.
Hashish.
Yeah. That's later. That's much later. That was like in Iran. It had
much later.
Yeah, 1,000-year mark.
I do have a question. You know one hell of a lot about history.
Yeah.
Are you basically arguing there's no point in you writing a book? I would say why not write a book? Really, that
You wrote one already.
Huh?
No, shut up.
No, I've read that one.
He
that
says,
that was more personal and it was great.
Yeah.
But I mean, why not a more? In a way, you're saying it doesn't help.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't. That's why you're doing this.
Yes.
well, it helped me.
I'm doing it this
I just
You're
have to.
here.
I just have to pester him with questions all the time. I guess that's the.
Well, see, when he wrote that book, that was before he studied as much history he has in the last 15 years.
Right.
Do you know he's not spouting off bullshit? You understand? He studied it, and to me, it's saying go write a book, but it would, in a way, you're saying it's pointless. I mean,
boy, you're putting me on this.
Well, I mean, look,
No, it's
Couldn't
Jared
hurt.
Diamond influenced me in my
Yeah.
thinking my way of thinking, in a way. And there have been great books that have been written, and whether it would be great or not. But I mean, in a way, it seems to me that 3 of us and whoever's going to listen to this and talking, that if he could get this out. But I think you're, in a sense, what your view of history is. It doesn't make any difference, except unless you're writing in China.
They don't need it. They have. That's what I mean. Yeah. Yes. That way of seeing the world of like, here's the intelligentsia and here's everybody else.
Yeah.
It's like 2 gears turning. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But I don't. Oh God. Yes, you could educate. Oh my God. It's like the better you are.
Talking to your mic, buddy.
The better you are at doing something, the more responsibility you have. And we carry our problems with us. So the idea that, if only we had the molten salt reactor and a few other technologies, then we would solve all our problems. No. If we were a spacefaring, we carry them with us. If we were a Star Trek type thing, you're confronted then with a situation where it's like, now we can destroy planets overnight. Literally, with an airstrike, an orbitable bombardment.
You're saying wherever you go, there you are.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So that's why the reason I'm doing this, like, what are the 3 great jewels of Cascadia again, Luke? We've been working on it.
Is rain one of them?
No, the landforms. Yeah, you have the Columbia Plateau,
Oh, right.
the Salish Sea,
Uh-huh,
and the Willamette Valley.
We've been working on him, he says. I've heard this once.
So yeah, Cascadia is going to appear out of the ground as, Christendom, the colonial.
Generally, those things weren't quite intentional.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
That's
Well,
the danger.
That's
Yeah,
the danger.
is it spontaneous or is it somebody's controlling this? I mean, that's the
Right.
We'd
I mean-
love to think there's somebody behind the curtain, but there isn't. It's just more of the world. You know, it's just
No, but I mean, how would Cascadia emerge? It'll just, I mean, that's his question. Spontaneously, out of somehow people, oh, we're all part of Cascadia.
Yeah.
They're going to have a common myth,
yes.
That's
right?
right.
And this is your three, your three.
Jewels.
Yeah, I mean, really, oh, it's a
Yes.
trinity even. Think about it.
Yes. That's the
They
danger.
come in trinities. Yeah.
That's the danger.
Not that it hasn't been tried before, but I think, the ones that persist are just sort of, they happen to be the ones that the lathe of heaven didn't cut down.
The lathe of heaven.
If there were 100, some amount of millennial cults and messianic
Oh,
cults,
yeah.
and
Of course.
and these ones lasted for 10 years, and this one lasted for a couple months, and these
Bible-
two were syncretic enough to be
Look at what the Bible,
converted to something else,
Look at
whatever.
what the Bible does. If you think of the Bible as an evolving thing, let's say there's this evil book that does bad things to people, and it's drifting through history like an iceberg, and it's shedding millennial groups. It's, like, oh, and then this group of fanatics, what are they reading? The Bible. What are they predicting? The end of the world. What a coincidence that they're all kind of the same. You ever heard of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom?
Yeah.
Mm.
30 million people got killed.
I always get them confused with the boxers.
No, boxers are a bit later, and they're up in the north.
Okay.
But yeah, when
Which one had the dude that thought he was Jesus' little brother?
That's the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom.
Okay. Did he also think he was bulletproof?
No, the boxers.
Those
thought
were
they
the boxers. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Jesus' little brother. He sets himself. He reads a Christian missionary brochure, has a dream of meeting.
A chick track.
Yes, he didn't speak English or anything, and he never really read the Bible, but he read a pamphlet about it, and then he had a fevered dream after failing the imperial exam system.
Oh, right.
three
Yeah.
times. Has a fevered dream where he meets an old man with a big white beard and a young man with a brown beard, because, I mean, Chinese leaders and those guys who have that sort of intensity, who are vulnerable to this sort of thing, they have a really big psychic antenna, so to speak, and they pick up. They can't help it.
They got their ears open.
They got
or
their ears
third
open.
eye open or
There's-
whatever.
Whatever. They're always meeting an old guy with a white beard, the Duke of Zhou. Mao met the Duke of Zhou in a dream.
Really?
Yeah, he talked about it. He was like, yeah, I haven't spoken to the Duke of Zhou a while ago,
Huh.
for a while. The Duke of Zhou is the guy who had the idea of the Mandate of Heaven
Huh.
in 1043 BC when they're overthrowing the Shang.
Also convenient for Mao,
Of course it is.
to-
Mao was nuts, but
But he tried to create a myth too. I
He
mean,
did.
Right.
Yeah, I mean
That's
that's
right.
what they all do.
Yeah.
yes. That's the danger. That's why you can't just be like, "Whoa, I want to write a book." Like,
Yeah.
no, yeah, books are devastating.
Yeah.
Books can be just absolutely.
And certainly academics that would read and understand or try to understand the book will have no difference.
And that's the thing. Academia has a role to play, but to sit there and say, okay, well, this is what's actually true and what's actually happening. Okay, great, good for you. It's the people on the ground, the lathe of humans and their myths evolving together. Some is getting cut away. Some keeps just appearing as if by magic from a book.
So, to me, I was a teacher for a long time, and I loved to learn and I loved to teach and I loved truth, and I think it was important. And I was always cautious about not being dogmatic and saying, let's work at this, and recognizing that bias is always going to be present. What we have to do is work together. What do you tell young people now? If you were in my boots teaching freshmen or sophomores, would I stick to trying to do the best job I can in oceanography or evolution? Or what would I do? Would I tell them, go start raising goats?
I would.
What
I
would you think?
I
I mean,
I don't know of any college courses about peak oil, but boy, you'd want to teach them about it and be like, again, my heart goes out to young people, but it would be tell them to stay in this part of the world.
yeah.
You might have to do something about the economics professors first.
Well, that's going to happen automatically. I mean, it's going to. From what I mean, from my understanding, capitalism, which thinks short term, this year's profit, cannot continue because it's destroying the planet. It's led to surely increased wealth, a lot of people consuming, and the gas is going to run out, and it's all dependent on this stuff. It's thinking short term.
Look, one of the changes in the imperial church of Rome, it went from being the emperor was more powerful than any of the bishops or whatever. It was the formal, required church that you had to do. Well, there's a quid pro quo with God, isn't there? Well, if we believe in you and say all the right words and stuff, you're going to keep us safe, right? And then the barbarians just kept coming. And in 410, it was sacked. The eternal city was sacked. And people lost faith in that imperial kind of church. The reason Augustine wrote The City of God was in response to the sack of Rome. They didn't put it in the context of like, oh, well, here were the technicalities of the geopolitics and who said what and why specifically. Yeah, and so if, Stilicho had still been alive and if Alaric had gotten the flu, then everything would be fine, right? That's why it happened? No, he had to write a corpus. He had to make a worldview that said, this is why it happened.
Yeah.
Don't lose faith.
Yeah.
God is still on your side and the church is still there for you,
Yeah.
right? Faith itself.
Belief.
Rather
than understanding.
Yeah. You can't, it's hard to understand. It hurts.
Yeah.
It hurts. The moon is lifeless and will always be lifeless. It's just a bare piece of rock spinning around in the infinite void.
Right.
You know how fast it's... Yeah.
Understanding is like standing on the surface of the moon. God, in the long run, nothing matters, truly.
Yeah.
You can't do that. You can't give that to people. And so he wrote that book, and then you can watch how the medieval church, after the breakdown of the imperial system, it's not the imperial church anymore. It becomes local. The papacy had to build itself up from the ground up. It had to send missionaries to Britain. It had to send missionaries.
Well, here's my question again. The papacy had to. No, the papacy had to. It didn't say, we have to do this. It happened.
That's what I'm... Yes.
Yes. It happened. I mean, that's the point of history. These things emerge out.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right.
And so with Cascadia, we are not making it happen. It is happening, and we are helping it happening. We are the midwives. Cascadia is being born. Every drop of rain.
Right. It's like, it's like I believe in fate and destiny. Fate and destiny are just what happened.
Yeah.
They are what are.
A causal, a causal link.
I don't really, but that's how I think of those words,
Yeah. And so, you have to be super. We are trying to, with Cascadia specifically, we are, with an understanding of human history, we are trying to help them bounce out of a dark age and just ease that bounce a little bit, ease suffering for a couple of centuries. Instead of it being a 150-year dark age, it might only be 50.
Yeah. I think ease suffering is a noble goal.
That's it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, maybe the only noble goal. Rather than trying to discover more truth and share the wisdom. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, this is, I'm not joking about it. This is I give to charity, right? So do I give to environmental groups now? I mean, that's where most of it goes. Liberals, environmental groups, and hungry people.
Sure.
Should I just start going all to the people that need it, that really, and at least keep a kid fed for a year?
Yeah.
I mean, that's where I honestly have an ethical dilemma, a moral dilemma.
Right. Well, and it's make a virtue out of the inevitable. not even a necessity.
Yeah.
The inevitable. It's so hard to sit there and it's like piloting a ship, and you go, or an airplane. Let's make it more deadly. So you go, hey, there's a 95% chance that we could get to this Shangri-La far away. But there's actually one, because there's a brick wall in between, you're going to run out of fuel. It seems like it's a 95% chance, but it's actually 0%. Even if you can almost get there, there is really, in the long run, only what does and does not happen. So if it's actually impossible, it is immoral to spend any energy that you can on the impossible. You can only, the moral, ethical thing to do is to understand the world well enough and causality well enough so that the consequences of your action just thread down that terribly thin razor line of doing the best you can with the resources at your potential, optimizing it. And so people are like, well, you know, we should really we should try to do what the Esperanto, you know. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's neat. It's neat, but
Yeah.
it's not doing good in the world because it's not going to happen. Languages have their own evolutionary course, and you can't do anything about that.
Sure.
You cannot stop it. So don't waste energy that could be feeding hungry people on Esperanto.
Yeah.
Even though you could, in an abstract sense, say, well, if everybody had the same language, then the world might be a better place and there might be less hunger. No, sorry, you know, I can't make that argument. Not in good conscience.
Yeah.
So and this comes down to like, hey, the three of us, this could be the Let's Save America podcast. And I'm like, you can't.
Yeah.
You know, we could, look, I have the Thanos glove right here. It's invisible. One snap of my fingers. Let's say with this snap of my fingers, I can double the efficiency of every internal combustion engine on the planet. Double it. Boom. Now you can go 10 miles per gallon instead of 5, what you were before, whatever. That's the equivalent of doubling all the world's oil reserves, right? Without doubling its emissions.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Make it 10 to 1. Boom. 10 times more efficient. You are doing that with your fancy Thanos glove would buy global civilization a decade or two.
Yeah. Well, you said the possible and the actual. There could have been many possible histories. There was one actual one.
Right.
There could be many possible futures. Going to be one actual one.
Right.
In between, if we try, we can make choices.
Yes.
And that's it. And so the choice comes down to, do I want to send my kids, who might be listening to this, do I want to go and try to become a famous doctor or, you know, make money as an engineer or whatever it is? Or what do I do? What do I do? It boils down to me. You either help people become more enlightened. Well, not either or. You can do that, or you can relieve the suffering,
Right.
or you can try to save as much of the natural environment as you can.
Right.
That's about it.
Right. Actually, this is dovetailing very nicely. I should pull out my Confucius.
I was just thinking of.
That's the great learning right there.
I
That's the
was
Dash
just
way.
thinking of the Buddha.
Yeah. Here,
I mean, that's it. That's it.
I mean yeah.
And
Enlightenment and easing suffering are both sort of embedded in foundational
Yeah.
Buddhist ideas,
Yeah.
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So we talk about continuity, and we talk about how do you do good in the world, and men and women for millennia before even writing were asking that question, and so somebody got it in writing. Nobody knows who wrote what I'm about to say. It comes from a book called the Book of Rites. It's not by Confucius.
Ooh, not the Book of Odes.
Right, yeah. Well, pretty much. All right. The ancients who wished to illustrate illustrious virtue throughout the kingdom first ordered well their own states. Wishing to order well their states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they first rectified their hearts. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. That's truth-telling. That's science. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. Such extension of knowledge lay in the investigation of things. The term is ga-wu, getting near things.
Yeah.
And that's Neo-Confucianism right there, and that text is the dissemination of all Confucian thought. And it was put together for 1,000 years. One of the greatest men who's ever lived is Zhu Xi. Put together 4 books: the Analects, the Doctrine of the Mean, and the Great Learning, the Da Shui.
Yeah.
And he said the Great Learning is the main thing. And for 1,000 years, men had to memorize those texts and answer very esoteric questions based on them, and they ran China.
Right,
Yeah.
and
It's a more successful institution than the papacy,
Yeah.
the imperial exam system.
Yeah.
It survived the Mongols.
Yeah.
That is the scientific worldview.
Yeah.
You have to investigate things.
Yeah.
And now
well,
the
and that's also right thinking or whatever,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Isn't that one of the
Sincerity of
8
thought.
noble
Yeah.
truths?
Now, what
And
about
also, seeing seeing reality as it is.
Yes,
you know, yeah.
trying to see it as it is,
Yes.
and you can't
And
do it by yourself?
No,
Yeah.
the community. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the three great jewels of Buddhism are the teachings,
Right, the monastic order, right?
No, well, no, the teachings of the Buddha himself,
Mm-hmm.
the meditation, and then the community. I think maybe I'm screwing this up. And then the community is the third one. The
Right.
community.
Well, I think that's the
Okay.
maybe more specifically the
Yeah.
monastic order,
Yeah.
but yeah.
But to do it, they did it. They
don't
pulled
know.
this off. It's astonishing to think about. They went. We want to govern China well, with virtue. How do you do this? It's tough. It's a real hard question. It's not. It's a question that confronts every group of human beings. And this guy, this Confucian scholar, put together this curriculum
Yeah.
talking about continuity,
Yeah.
and and made it incredibly difficult to get into the highest levels of it. And for 1,000 years, basically from the Song dynasty, the Northern Song even, all the way until the last exam was held in like 1911.
I actually
Incredible.
went to a museum in Nanjing where they gave the imperial exam.
You've been to one?
Well, I've been where they. I mean,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
and they have this museum,
Yeah.
and one of the things they have there is how these guys tried to cheat.
Yes.
Awesome.
I mean, as they use doves, and they'd have things written in
Wow.
Their
places.
underwear. They
Yeah,
had their
I mean,
underwear.
this
They
sort of
wanted-
thing. I mean,
Awesome.
of course, obviously, they all didn't do that, but
No.
I mean, the
Right.
pressure on them was tremendous.
Intense.
Yeah,
If you died, your family didn't know about it until after the exam. It was 3 days.
Yeah.
3 days. You had a pitcher of water. You had your ink stone and your
Yeah.
brush.
yeah, and so
And go ahead.
What a
I
drag.
just could say that's a great museum. Nanjing, if you want to look at modern Chinese history, you can go to Beijing, Xi'an, these other places,
Right.
but Nanjing
Oh yeah.
is for modern history is a great place to go because it's got the Chiang Kai-shek and the communists and
Ah.
everything there. It's just it's a really
Rad.
great.
A lot happened in Nanjing
Yeah.
over and over. It was the Southern Song dynasty. I think it means Southern capital, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
that's
what Nanjing. Beijing is northern
Yeah.
capital. Yeah,
I mean, so the Southern Song that was there. That's where they went
Yeah.
after the Jurchen took northern China.
Yeah.
And then that was the capital of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom.
Mm.
It's where Chiang Kai-shek was based. I mean, a lot has happened in Nanjing. Big intact city walls, if I recall, visually. Yeah.
no, it
But-
still has it. No, Xi'an has the city wall.
I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I rode.
Nanjing
I
still
got
has
to
some-
ride around them on a tandem bicycle.
Oh, you did.
So, and with the exam system, you had to do it no matter who your dad was and no matter how wealthy you were. So you would have these guys who had been privately tutored all their lives since like 10 years old. And they know all the stuff, and they've got all the nice clothes and all this other stuff. And they had to go into this reeking, terrifying exam system
Yeah.
alongside little peasant boys, and
Yeah.
outside. It was just a kick in the
Not
teeth for them.
everyone took it, right?
No.
Anybody could.
Oh,
males.
really?
Any
Only
males,
men.
yeah.
But it
any
was
males.
open.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
Ah,
this is a great.
interesting.
This is one of the great lessons. I mean, thing about Chinese history is it was this based on education. Everybody.
Meritocratic.
Yeah,
true
merit-
merit.
Wow.
There is a genre of literature in Chinese in that continuity of like rich kid, poor kid, and the poor
Taking
kid
the
passes-
exam.
taking the
Oh,
exam
wow.
together. Yeah, Prince and
Gotcha.
the Pauper type.
Well,
thing.
it's
Gotcha.
in the opera. It's in.
Yeah.
I mean, this poor student working away and
Yeah.
the temptations that come to him.
It's even in kung fu flicks. I mean, I think I don't.
I'm sure,
I don't
yeah.
know when they're all set, but
Right.
like you said, the civil exam lasted,
3 days.
or I mean, from its inception
Oh,
to
yeah, yeah.
1911.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're often,
Millennia.
kung fu are protagonists who are supposed to be doing homework. They're tutors.
And I think it could be argued that whatever you think of their politics or their ethics or anyway, but the leaders that come forth in China usually, I'm not talking, usually are ones that have worked hard, have studied. I mean, they really are, and they're smart. Generally,
I have been reading. Speaking of continuity, Xi Jinping thought, and he knows the Confucian classics.
Yeah.
Every speech he has is sprinkled with phrases from this one scholar from the spring and autumn period.
and he could probably quote poems from
I'm sure he could.
from
Du Fu.
yeah,
Yeah.
from and before
Yeah.
Dao Yunming. I mean, he probably could. And he could do it. He could do it with when you listen to it, you say, "I wish I could do that.
Yeah.
I wish I'd do it in English."
Yeah. I mean, it probably this would have to come after, actually working on my Mandarin, but if one were to learn Mandarin, then it would be a neat thing to learn all those 4-syllable phrases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
those are so fun.
Oh.
Yeah,
I can't remember what they have a name, in Mandarin.
Well, that
but I
one
can't-
poem from the Lanting Shu, the gathering,
Yeah.
the Orchid Pavilion gathering,
Yeah.
that was written at a time, a dark time in Chinese history.
And he
It-
was,
they were dominated by foreigners. The country had fallen apart, and it's an astonishingly beautiful, nostalgic.
it makes you weep.
It made me
It,
weep.
it made you weep when he read it. When he told it to me, it made him weep.
Yeah,
Which is what great poetry can do.
right.
Great poetry can do that.
And it's just like the emperor was expected to be able to paint, to be able to write poems, and he would communicate with his subject through poetry.
Yeah.
That's a feature they share with Islamic emperors.
Yeah.
You know, like the Ottoman Sultan would sit there like as a formal state. Like a formal political statement was
Yeah.
a poem, and like so the continuity of it and what it's a continuity about, because it was a commitment for meritocracy and national improvement that they actually made 1,000 years ago to say, no, we're going to make this available for peasants too. We understand that aristocrats will have an advantage because they're rich, but a peasant boy, nobody, can still take the exam. We will not shut him out.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. I
Yeah.
don't think-
no,
That's just an incredible thing because those ancient societies, the only people who really did matter were the aristocrats.
yeah.
The only economy was land-based.
When you're saying that with the aristocrats and the poor people, I'm just thinking that the students that were cheating were probably from the rich families. I mean, who would ever know? But
Bribery.
my guess would be that it was the
Yeah.
students from the rich families because
Yeah.
they already had the advantage and they figured they should. And the other guy's going to work hard to get it.
Yeah, and one of the bureaucrats, the educated gentlemen, the Jinshi, were so well paid that you only needed one son every 3 generations. So like if grandpa had it, your family was set.
Wow.
And you only needed like maybe his grandson to also pass. So dozens of sons in these families were not passing.
Right.
Were only at the highest level, maybe 4 a year, maybe, or maybe 4 every 3 years. We're making it to the Forbidden City.
Yeah.
After that was the thing. So think about that. This institution of scholarship and a curriculum was surviving civil wars, foreign invasions, natural disasters, everything that a society goes through. And here's this institution of real education actually happening.
Well, but there's a problem. And the problem is my friend who has founded private schools in China. The problem with the Chinese system teaches to the test.
Yeah.
And he, like I at a liberal arts college, felt critical thinking is important. And he agrees with that. It's hard to do. But the problem with that is, and I have other people, one, she's retired now, who was a teacher. And basically, you try to get the students prepared for that test. If they don't get into that high school and then from that high school and passing the exam at a certain level, they don't go to the college.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. So what do? You teach to the test. And that's the problem with it.
Yeah.
You understand?
And it's so heavy on memorization.
Yeah, that's
Just
it. It's
rote
rote.
memory.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's basically what Shao Wei will say. It's rote.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think? How do you act? And this is why he appreciated his education in the States. Was a chance to have that sort of challenge. Ask questions and challenge and think more critically.
Yeah.
The also thing is that most of those students are going to get channeled into engineering or finance or economics or something like that. I mean, a student that wants to go study mushrooms is sort of out of. What are they going to do?
Right.
Who wants somebody that wants to go understand the world rather than perform and make money in the world? And so there is a problem with it today anyway. And I'm sure it was always there.
Yeah.
This raises the question of what should education be? That's basically what we're talking. Why are we doing this?
Why are we doing this?
Yeah,
How do you understand the world in an
Yeah.
ethical way?
yeah,
How do you not lie to yourself?
yeah.
how do you put it? How do you have sincerity of thought?
How can you look yourself in the face? All right. I remember he said that. I asked him what I said. I tell my grandsons I wouldn't have kids if I were you. You know, they're getting reproductive age, and he says, "Well, yeah. How else could you look them in the face if you had kids in this soon?" I know you have a young child, and
Right.
I understand.
No, the thought has occurred to me.
Yeah.
You know.
Here's your world.
But-
Fucked it up real
Yeah.
good.
Sorry, I brought that in, but
Oh no.
yeah, but I mean, it is. If we're talking about the future, education. I mean, knowledge, history.
Yeah.
And here we are, three guys sitting here talking into these little black mushroom looking things.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, it would be wonderful to be, it's a good time to be Chinese. See, the reason they had a crisis of faith in themselves, in Chineseness, in Chinese civilization after the Opium Wars
Yeah.
and the Japanese invasion. It was 150 years of agony. And now they've stood up. They're
Yeah.
on their feet again. And this is the Chinese century. And good for them.
Good for them. I agree.
And
I agree.
so they have that self-confidence now, and that's where everything's going to happen for about the next century. While here, things are just going to slow down.
I mean, when you think about it, I mean, maybe we talked about this before. You take a look at the map of the world. I mean, here's China 2,000 years ago. It's not quite as big as it is now. You go 500 years, it's almost that size.
Yeah.
There's no United States. Where have we? Now we are in both northern and southern hemisphere, eastern and western hemisphere. We fought wars on every side of China,
Yeah.
right? Where's China's wars? They're all local,
Hmm.
right? I mean, who's kidding themselves about who's interfering in world politics? And we want to bring democracy, we say? This Hong Kong thing, whoa, what do they do? It's a bunch of garbage. I mean, what about Saudi Arabia? You know,
Well, okay.
Saudi
You
Arabia has
brought it
oil.
up.
Huh?
Yeah, I mean, if you want, here's the other thing, though. Think about this. The counter to that, from the Chinese perspective. That took me a long time to realize what was happening. The United States was exporting oil until the mid-1960s.
Mm-hmm.
It peaked in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the reasons Mao was able to consolidate his rule is he defeated a full Imperial United Nations army on the Korean Peninsula
Mm-hmm.
by himself. He had very little Russian help,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a big feather in his hat.
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam, the Vietnam War, where we also lost. So you say we're fighting these wars, we're losing them.
No, I
And
didn't
they
say
are-
we won.
Right,
Yeah.
and and if you think about it from a strategic Chinese perspective, now where are our American boys dying? Afghanistan. It seems to be getting farther and farther away from China.
But it's still fairly close.
Of course it is, but you look at Asian economic integration that's unfolding right before our eyes. Literally yesterday, November 2nd, 2019, the natural
December.
gas started. Oh yeah, whoops. The natural gas started flowing into northern China from Russia to,
Yeah.
and boy, there's
And that's that big $5 billion or $15 billion deal that they made several years ago.
400 million
Okay.
at first.
Yeah.
After the Russian, after we tried to sanction them, and
Yeah.
you can't sanction Russia. It doesn't make sense. It's not working. But you look at Asian economic integration, and we are being left out in the cold, and it's going to get real cold because there's no oil or natural gas to keep our lifestyle going in the Western Hemisphere. They are isolating us on the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
Just snipping the threads one by one, very carefully, with extreme discipline and precision, and it's happening.
So explain succinctly for whoever's listening why fracking. I mean, a lot of people have this hope in fracking.
Okay.
Why it's not going to work. I mean,
Okay.
make it clear so
Okay.
18-year-old student can understand.
Okay. Fracking is going into the source rock where traditional oil fields came from. It's going upstream, so to speak. And it is the process of industrially industrially doing what nature normally does to make a normal oil field. So now humans are paying the cost that nature did for free for us over tens of millions
And
of
investing
years.
energy in that.
Yes, and that costs a lot more energy. One fracking well, even in a sweet spot, a single fracking well in the Permian Basin might cost $10 million. So now that expense has to be borne by the human economy instead of getting it for free from nature. And so it makes the oil uneconomical at any price because the industrial investment you have to do sucks up any profits that could conceivably come out of the ground. And because of the geology, they tend to peak extremely quickly, so that a single fracked well that costs $10 million might produce 30,000 barrels a day for the first 4 months. But by the end of the year, within 12 months, it might only produce 100 barrels a day. And so if the price of oil is at, right now it's $54 a barrel, by December you are only making $5,000 a day off of that well, maybe. And you will never pay off that $10 million. So it ends up being a Ponzi scheme where only the people who got in first are able to get any money off of it, basically by selling at fraudulent prices oil wells that are worthless. After we go into the fracking and it's all used up, there's nowhere else to drill.
Yeah. So then it's back to Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq. I mean,
They can frack too.
well, no, but I mean,
Yeah.
for the next 10 or 15 years of oil.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So we have, the thing is though, if they are able to, the U.S. uses, just the United States uses about 20 million barrels of oil a day every single day. The European Union uses about 15. China's number 3 at 13, I think. If they are able to isolate us in North America and just let us wither away and freeze to death during our winters, suddenly those 20 million barrels of oil become available for other people. The world is the lathe of heaven is cutting the oil haves into the oil have-nots. And the invasions of Iraq and the destruction of Libya and the invasions of Syria, these sorts of things are actually the last gasp, desperate, flailing measures of the United States to keep itself in the oil haves section. The fracking boom is a black hole in the heart of our financial system. It is a Ponzi scheme that has not made any money.
Infinite sink.
Yes, and it's because you can throw all the money you want in there and no net profit will come back.
Oh.
It's like a boat.
With a hole in it.
Yeah.
So that's what it's hard to appreciate. Half of all the natural gas, because the natural gas also comes up, is from fracking. $250 billion of money has gone down fracking wells, and none of it will come back.
Yeah.
And the reason why,
I could have used some of that
could have
too.
used some of that. Maybe we should have spent it on molten salt reactors or something. But for 10 years, see the criticism of the right of like
I was
Obama,
thinking
Obama
Nintendo
and his
games, but-
environmental regulations and all that. It's like the fracking boom was his. That's his.
Yeah.
It happened during his time,
Yeah.
2008 till about 2018.
Yeah.
You know, and now it's over. And it's over. It's ending right now.
So we
There-
shouldn't think of him as the drone strike president. We should think of him
He
as the
should be that too.
fracking president.
Well,
Yeah. In terms of actual oil reserves, proven oil reserves on the ground, the United States is below Libya. We're number like 13 in the world.
Yeah.
We're just above Kazakhstan. And they go, well, yeah, okay, but look at how high our production is. That doesn't change the production reserves. If
Yeah.
I have a big tank with a finite volume of it, 100 gallons, if I pull 1 gallon out a day, it's going to last me 100 days.
Yeah.
If I pull out 50 gallons a day, it's going to last me 2.
Wait. Oh, I could have got it.
What?
Just joking.
Oh, so that sucking sound That's the very last of the fossil fuel reserves of North America. There's no hidden oil somewhere
No.
in Canada.
Yeah.
There's no like, whoops, we forgot to look in Wyoming. Hey, man, there was this big blank spot on the map somewhere between Manitoba and West Virginia, and we just never thought to look there over the past 150 years.
Or recently I heard where just go plant a bunch of trees. They'll take, I mean, thinking about climate, they'll take up the carbon dioxide. Meanwhile, you're still putting out more and more and more. I do agree with planting trees, but
It's over.
because you
guys.
might need them for fuel very quickly. Right?
Dude, an instructive example, it's kind of macabre, but was how Nazi Germany ground to a halt after we blew up the oil fields in Romania,
Yeah.
of all places. Germany just stopped.
Yeah.
All those tanks and planes that they had they just stopped. And then the U.S. Air Force, because you know what won the oil fields of Texas were what made American, and the Soviets victory possible. The German army ground to a halt in place because it depended heavily on the oil fields of Romania, and they tried to grab the oil fields of southern Russia in like.
And that's probably why they're in Africa then too, in North Africa maybe for Libya.
No,
No.
The North African oil industry was not developed.
No, I mean, but I was just wondering why the Germans were there when you said that.
Oh God.
No,
That's
don't get into it. It doesn't have to do with oil. We don't have time.
Right. So it's over. And so they were trying to make cars that could run on coal. They had cars running on wood, and it just stopped. Nazi Germany just ground to a halt. And there's this one, I have the book right over, sitting over there. Albert Speer came to Hitler, and his architect, he basically ran the German economy from his desk for like the last 3 years. Young guy, And he said that it was after the oil fields in Romania, because Romania was an Axis ally, and they had tremendous refining and all that. There was an oil field that a coal mining region in like Galicia, somewhere in Eastern Europe, that the Soviets eventually took. And Albert Speer literally came to Hitler and said, "We have 2 weeks. We have 2 weeks left, and then your tanks won't run, and your planes won't fly." And your cars won't run, and your factories will all shut down. And Hitler said, "I don't like it when you talk to me. It's always bad news." I don't like meeting Albert Speer. And Albert Speer was exactly right.
It's kind of short notice.
There's no energy to run your civilization.
Well, right, but I mean, shouldn't he have seen that coming, 6 weeks in advance?
But
they knew. They were trying to defend it, but the Soviet juggernaut was so great. It's like you just literally can't.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And so here's what's really cool. That 2-week notice is the same exact number in that completely unrelated book called When the Trucks Stop Running.
Yeah.
If the trucks stop running, you have 2 weeks of civilization left. Because if the trucks aren't running, there's no coal getting delivered to your coal-fired electricity plant. And if they're not running, there's no medicines in your hospitals. And then your electric power plants, even a renewable one like hydropower, shut down because there's no spare parts getting there.
Okay.
I feel like Hitler.
Well, but I mean,
Don't we
It's
all?
a bad joke.
but I mean, maybe
You're
it is.
Speer at this.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
Speer.
Yeah, but the question is it how is it different from Hitler? It's not Speer and Hitler. You have these oil companies that must see the future
They
coming.
do.
And it must be the automobile companies and the people building these. And we're just going to add another $1 billion for another freeway over here. Or are they looking ahead?
No.
They're just thinking about next year's game.
What are they supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? I know what
I already said what I said. I asked you, what should I do? Should I,
You
how do I want to live a moral life? And I don't have much of my life left, so I better hurry.
You need to buy farmland and help me build the infrastructure of it, the sustainable infrastructure. It's not hypothetical. I know how to farm this area.
Yeah.
It's not hypothetical.
Yeah.
There's nowhere to go if there's no oil. You just sit there and watch the weather roll by. And go, man, I'm hungry. Better go grow some potatoes. There's a reason why I built an anaerobic digester in my backyard. If I was in charge of any sort of program that would have like long-reaching type stuff, especially in the context of Cascadia, it would be that. Because when it's cold, we are the hairless ape who's not very well adapted to this climate.
Mm-hmm.
And we go, I'm cold. And it's like, are you going to endure the cold like a Buddhist monk? Let it wash over you and over and through you? Or are you going to cut down all your trees to stay warm for a winter or two? Or are you going to have a little anaerobic digester? Deforestation is the kiss of death for an agricultural society.
Yeah.
But if we can keep the trees alive in this part of the world,
Yeah.
those forests will be the new temples.
Yeah. Plant trees.
Plant trees, but build anaerobic digesters because you throw all your poo in there, and now you can heat your house and cook your
And
food.
all the stuff that falls off the trees around here, I know. I clean it up all the time. You can throw that in there, the cones and the needles, and
Biomass is a blessing.
yeah,
Biomass is wealth.
yeah.
It's energy.
Tell that to your. No, never mind.
Well,
Oil is biomass, isn't it?
it is. It's condensed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Refined, distilled biomass. So it's coal.
With regard to the whole concept, are we going to quit pretty quick? I'm going to add because I think we should. The whole concept of Cascada, you know, that we're sitting on one of the biggest continuous fault zones.
Yeah.
Cascadia, subduction zone.
Yeah.
So with the whole concept of Cascada, shit could happen. I mean,
Yes.
I'm talking about this in your social,
Oh yeah.
historical sense as well as the geological
Oh man.
sense.
When that tsunami goes barreling down
Well,
the Puget Sound,
yeah.
well, that's a good blank slate to build Cascadia on. Isn't it?
Very good.
Good stuff, hey?